All right, let's get started. So, today's topic is efficient self-attention transformers that can be applied to very long sequences. So we'll be covering a bunch of different models at a fairly high level. We'll cover some in more detail, and then go over some of the pitfalls with all of these models. Before we do that, a lot of stuff was released recently, so you have a quiz. It's due this coming Friday. There's an extra credit homework that was released. It's due the last day of final exams, December 16th. This is the same deadline as the one for your final project report. We will release an overleaf template similar to the proposal template for the report in the next couple weeks. The extra credit homework has to be done in full, so if you just do half of it, you're not going to get any partial credit. It could take a while. It involves training a bunch of different models, similar to homework 1, these kinds of BERT type models, so don't start on December 16th. Homework 1, your annotation thing is due, what is this, next week? The week after next? I don't know. It's sometime soon. I saw a bunch of you have asked questions on whether your task is okay. We are trying to answer those as quickly as possible, but in general, we are okay with anything as long as you're not doing some like vanilla, is this review positive or negative? So any sort of fine-grained distinction is, even if it could be classified as a sentiment problem, is fine. Just don't do something super boring. You can feel free to keep asking on Piazza, and the TA will probably just say whatever you picked is fine, but feel free to ask anyway. So the midterm is coming up a couple of days after this homework is due. So you have a bunch of practice midterms right now in Piazza, and the solutions to all of those will be posted next week. So if you want to attempt all the problems before then, go for it, and we'll post the solution so you can check your answers next week. We'll also go over the problems next week. So there'll be a midterm review session in class, I think next Thursday, where you can ask any questions you want, and if you have no questions, I'll just keep going over the exam problems and so on. All right, any admin logistics questions? Okay, so is it okay to use default hyperparameters if they're, I assume this is for homework 1? Sure, just, you know, in your write-up at the end, describe, at least say that you tried other configurations. Okay, so what we're focusing on here today is the quadratic complexity of self-attention, the vanilla self-attention that you've been taught, and how we can use different methods to reduce this. This is quadratic complexity in both time and memory, what self-attention is taking up. This really limits your effectiveness on longer sequences and your ability to use these models on longer sequences. So when I say quadratic complexity, is quadratic in the sequence length, right? So n here is the number of tokens in your input. So one of the readings assigned for this class was the survey on efficient transformers. So there, if you read that, you would notice that there's a ton of different efforts to actually optimize the self-attention in particular. We'll cover a couple of these, but just note, like, as some practical evidence that this is an issue, these are times that people in my lab have measured with a transformer-based language model, GPT-2, the medium model, not even the biggest one, timed on a single 2080 Ti GPU. So this isn't like the best GPU, but it's certainly not the worst. It's probably better than what you have access to on Colab. Okay. All right, I didn't notice what that thing before. Is that like a escape hatch or something. All right, anyway, so, right, in this table, you see the time it takes to decode a specified number of target tokens given a number of input tokens. So if I have 100 tokens in my prefix, how long does it take to produce 100 more tokens? And this is just using greedy search, right? So it's greedy decoding. It's not any fancy decoding algorithm. If you use beam search, it would be even slower. So you can see that if you have 100 tokens of context, then generating 300 tokens is actually quite slow, right? 7.3 seconds. If you have 300 context tokens, it's almost 10 seconds to generate 300 more tokens. So if you are in some practical scenario where you want to deploy one of these models and you're resource constrained, you only have like one GPU, the latency for your users might be higher than you would ideally like. So if you are able to reduce the complexity of the self-attention mechanism, which is one of the main drivers of these speedups, then perhaps you would be able to reduce the latency to your users. So a lot of these efforts aim to reduce the time, essentially, that you take to process an input and generate a token, but preserve the model's performance. So for language models, we're usually focused on perplexity, right? So if we make one of these modifications to make our self-attention mechanism more efficient, did we also increase the perplexity by a lot? Because if we did, then probably this isn't a very useful modification that we made. So yeah, there's this kind of balance between performance and speed that we're aiming for with all of these things. So this was one of the figures in the reading, and it gives you just some idea of all the different types of approaches that people have tried. So we'll cover, I think, 3 different kinds of things from this, this giant Venn diagram. But here, the simplest of the approaches is just, so when you have your self-attention, you have to form this n by n matrix, right? We've seen this. If you have n tokens in your input, you're forming this matrix n by n, and in language modeling, where you're producing the next word, you are applying a mask to this matrix, right? But you still have to compute all of the entries in the matrix and then apply this mask. To get around computing all of the elements in this n by n matrix, the simplest approach you can possibly use is to replace this full self-attention with some fixed patterns or like even random patterns. So instead of having a single token attend to all of the previous tokens or all of the other tokens in the sequence, as you would in say, BERT, you could have it attend to just the last 5 tokens always, or 5 tokens surrounding this token in a window. So here you've certainly reduced the complexity of this mechanism, right? But on the other hand, you're probably also hampering its performance by doing something like this, because now at every layer, each token, the self-attention is only looking at representations that are locally close by to that token. So there are other more complicated versions of this where the model actually learns these kinds of sparse patterns using its training objective to guide it into maybe this particular pattern is useful for a particular task. There are memory-based models where instead of treating the entire sequence as a sequence of tokens, you're going to take tokens that are far away and compress them. So if you have let's say you have 8,000 tokens in your input sequence and you want to do self-attention over all 8,000 tokens, one approach could be you take the first 6,000 tokens of the sequence and you compress them into, say, 1 vector or 3 vectors. So you have some method of downsampling these 6,000 individual token representations to just a single vector. So now, if you apply self-attention to, say, the last 2,000 words plus this compressed representation of the last 6,000 words preceding even those, you have reduced the complexity of your self-attention mechanism, but it's very hard to find a function that can effectively compress huge amounts of information like this. One way in which you can implement this kind of memory or compression is through a recurrent neural network. So we briefly talked about the transformer XL, which is one approach to do this. The compressive transformer is another. Both of them apply recurrent mechanisms to essentially aggregate large blocks of text into a smaller sequence or even a single vector that can then be attended to. And finally, there are low-rank approximations of this n by n matrix. So these are also kind of interesting. We'll talk about one of them, the Linformer, in a little bit of detail. But you can see by this diagram, there's lots of intersections between many of these different approaches. And a lot of this research has been driven purely by, can we keep the perplexity almost the same as the vanilla transformer while making it faster? But it's not like any of these are actually notably better than the vanilla transformer in terms of language modeling. They might be faster, but they're not better. And another question that we'll get to at the end of this class is how these models, which are theoretically capable of modeling longer sequences more efficiently, how are they actually making use of contexts that are well in the past, like 8,000 words? What kind of information are they finding useful from these contexts? Okay, so just as a review, you've probably seen all of these. Actually, you've seen these with the animations. The animations were breaking my computer today, so I just have some screenshots, unfortunately. But let's assume that we're in a BERT-style setup. There's no masking of the attention involved. We're just doing full attention over every other position in the sequence. So here, the complexity comes when we try and compute the attention scores, right? Because for every single position in the sequence, I'm computing this dot product between the query at that position and the key at every other position, right? So if I repeat this process using the query vector for Nobel, then I have to do this again for the query vector of committee with all the other keys and so on. That's how I form this n by n attention matrix, right? And this is where the quadratic complexity is coming from. So to get these distributions, right, these attention distributions at every time step, I need to perform a query and all of the keys, this dot product at every time step. So, right. One trick that is probably the simplest approach of all is essentially to get rid of the self-attention completely and instead hard-code it. So every time you want to compute self-attention, instead of actually having these scores depend on things like query vectors and key vectors, what if you just said that if I'm at position X, I'm going to assign position X minus 1 to 0.5 attention, position X minus 2 to 0.2 attention, and so on. Regardless of what the word is or what position I'm at, I could use the exact same pattern. So this is the simplest step in our kind of progression to more complex attention methods. So this hard-coded self-attention, if you think about the same example, let's say I'm at this position Strickland, and I want to assign an attention distribution. And I don't want to do this query key dot product because it's very expensive. One thing I can do is simply just, let's say I have a normal distribution that's centered around the word Strickland, and that is going to just define my attention scores. Right? This is not satisfying for many reasons. Someone give me a reason why this could be bad. So he said it doesn't make use of any long-range dependencies in this input, which is certainly true at one layer. However, if you stack this across multiple layers, then the dependencies will propagate through, you can imagine like if this is the first layer, then this, when we do this kind of weighted average of the value vectors, I'm taking some information from the word who, from the word Strickland, awards, committee, and Nobel, right? So in the next layer, if I stack this, and I do the same thing, the vector at the word Strickland now has information about the word Nobel. So if it's used in some attention computation over here, that information could be propagated over the entire sequence in just 2 layers. So yeah, I mean, this is maybe an issue if you have a very shallow network, but as you make it deeper, the receptive field of even the simple hard-coded attention will increase. So you can make it arbitrarily deep to satisfy whatever input sequence length you have.
We might be attending to words which are not that informative and pretending less to the words which are more informative.
Yeah, so there's no like notion of one word being more important than another word in a given context here, right? We're just saying, regardless of what the word is at this position or this position, I'm going to use this same normal distribution centered around this position, and that's going to be my attention scores. Yeah.
How is that a problem when we are already calculating that? If it's not if that code is not important, then it would already have a low attention score, right?
So in this setup, the question I think is, wouldn't a word that's not important already have a low attention score if we're computing self-attention?
Yeah.
But in this case, we don't have queries or keys. We've tossed all of that out. So replacing this step here, where we take the query key dot product to get the attention distribution, instead, we're just going to go directly to this and use a fixed distribution at every position here. So it's not content-based at all. That is this specific approach, using just like fixed patterns. Does that make sense? Oh, how do you choose this distribution? So that is kind of arbitrary. This approach, actually, my student Simong tried it out, and this was the very first thing that she selected, and it seemed to work pretty well. There's also an even simpler approach, which is to make this just a binary thing where you assign probability of 1 to some position and probability of 0 to every other position. If you have multiple heads, you can just swap around what position is getting all the probability mass. So essentially, this, if you were familiar with like convolutional neural networks, is working similarly to a convolution, like a 1D convolution with a fixed kernel that you're not learning. But yeah, I mean, it seems like in certain tasks, the choice of pattern is kind of irrelevant for performance, which is striking because one of the main motivations intuitively of self-attention is that it, like you actually are learning that some words are more important to making a certain prediction than others. You are getting these kinds of alignments that are interpretable and whatever, but possibly that is not the driver of performance in these models, and actually something much more complicated is happening in those giant feed-forward layers that these models have that we can't really interpret properly. So there have been a number of studies like this with like drastic simplifications of the attention. Obviously, this is much faster, right, than computing the full n-by-n query key dot product matrix because there's no computation involved. Yeah. So the question is, instead of fixing this to some distribution, why don't we just learn it as a parameter through gradient descent? So in that case, we still don't have these queries and keys, right? We just have some distribution that is being optimized. It might be used at every single position, or it could be a position-dependent parameter as well. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. It's probably similar to some of the stuff in the learnable patterns area of work that people have tried. But yeah, definitely worth exploring. So remember, you have multiple heads here. So one thing you can do, even though one pattern is limited, you could just have each head correspond to a different pattern. So like, we tried a bunch of things. Maybe here the distribution is centered around the center of this window, here to the left, and maybe you have one head that is always looking at the very, very first token in the sequence. You have one head that's looking at the end of the sequence. You could make up arbitrary things. I mean, the self-attention that is learned by the model is not particularly interpretable itself. We'll look at this closely when we talk about probe tasks. That's after the midterm. But yeah, it's hard to correlate any one head to a specific linguistic property that the model is actually trying to look at. So if that's the case, then whatever. Maybe we can just make up patterns, and the model will learn how to use those in some way. So right, like I said, this is equivalent to a convolution, and you can apply this same kind of notion to if you're doing encoder decoder. Right, we saw this in T5 and any machine translation model. We have three types of attention. We have self-attention in the encoder, self-attention in the decoder, and then cross-attention from decoder to encoder. You can do this hard coding for all of these types. So my student Simang and master's student a couple years ago looked at this. And we looked at it in the context of machine translation. So again, to just reinforce, in machine translation, our evaluation is through the BLUE score, which we talked about. So these are all BLUE scores. And these are on 6 different data sets. You can see the translation quality when we're using a normal encoder-decoder transformer model. So this is with all of the heads learned using the full n-squared self-attention. And this is what happens if you use some of these arbitrary patterns and toss away the learned self-attention. So on this English to German data set, it even gets a little better, which is weird. On some languages it's much worse. We found, for example, in larger data sets where you generally benefit from bigger models, this is when you start seeing more and more of a gap between a learned self-attention and these kind of simple patterns. So this English to French data set is quite big. I forget how many millions of examples it has, but there's about a 1 blue gap here, which is not huge. It's still impressive that a model without queries and keys can do this well, but there is a gap. So many of the approaches that we'll be talking about afterwards aim to make it such that there's no gap at all. There's no noticeable difference between the efficient model and the vanilla transformer model. We also did some experiments where we completely removed the self-attention. So this is kind of interesting because you are just essentially propagating the token level information up to the feed forward layer, and then there's no real mixing of the information in any of across the tokens in the input. This completely wrecks your BLUE score, so at least some context is required. It's very fast though, so. Okay, but with this hard-coded self-attention, we were able to increase the batch size. So batch size, obviously very important. Increasing batch size means we were able to reduce the amount of memory that it takes per example. And we were able to get a speed up of about 30% over the baseline transformer in terms of decoding speed. So how long does it take to produce a sequence of length x at test time? You might be looking at this and going like, well, you got rid of the most important component of the transformer, this quadratic self-attention, and yet you were only able to get a 30% speed up. Isn't that really low? Wouldn't you expect some huge, incredible speed up? At least that's what we thought, and we were disappointed by only a 30% speed up. But then when you actually profile the model and see what is taking up most of the time, most of the flops, It's really the giant feed-forward layer in the model, right? So you compute all the head representations, you concatenate them, and you feed them to this feed-forward layer. This happens at every block of the transformer. So this thing is by far the biggest contributor of, in practical scenarios where the sequences are not very long. So in machine translation, your sequences are usually sentences. You're doing sentence-to-sentence translation. Your sequence length might be, 40 or 50 tokens long. This is not a regime in which the quadratic complexity of self-attention dominates the computations that the feed-forward layers are doing. However, if you go to a setting where you have 50,000 tokens in your input, now the quadratic complexity of the self-attention starts to dominate. But there are very few tasks in NLP that have, at least currently, that require context that long. However, there are now in computer vision, more and more people are starting to use transformers for like everything. In that case, you have many, many more inputs if you, for example, linearize an image. So you have like a sequence of pixels. Now you have all these dependencies that are potentially across very long sequences. And a lot of the efficient transformer work is evaluated on image problems as well as character level language modeling. So that's another case where in NLP you can artificially make a very long sequence by just switching from word level tokenization to character or even byte tokenization now that we have that. Yeah. Okay. If the batch size was held constant, would we expect to see more of a performance gap? Not sure what performance you're referring to. I assume the speed, in which we did see a performance. Sorry, we did keep the batch size constant. Okay, any questions? Yeah, so the question is, has there been any work on speeding up the feed-forward layer? Probably. I'm not sure off the top of my head if there is. Yeah, I'd be curious to. I know, like, before transformers were a thing, there was a lot of work on like low-rank approximations of some of the like both weight matrices and like that are used in feed-forward layers and things like LSTMs and tree LSTMs. I'm not sure if that kind of work has made it over to the transformer yet. I feel like it has, and I'm just forgetting something though. So if you find something, you can post it on Piazza. Yes?
Is this technique much better than just using convolutional neural networks to do machine learning?
It's very similar. I mean, obviously the transformer has a lot of additional component. Oh, sorry. The question is this basically identical to applying a CNN convolutional neural network to solve machine translation? Like the concept of having this kind of fixed kernel sliding across the sequence is, of course, very similar to what you would have in a 1D convolution. If you actually learn that distribution as he was suggesting, then it's identical, essentially. But remember that the transformer has lots of other components that are outside of the self-attention, right? It has these like position embeddings, it has layer normalization, it has residual connection, all these other tricks that that are just as important to its performance, if not more important. So if you added all of those things into a CNN, then sure, I bet it would do basically the same. Yeah.
You mentioned that when they increase the batch size, the memory required reduces.
When we so sorry, this first bullet point you're talking about? So just to explain what this means. So basically, when we get rid of the queries and keys like we're doing here, we are saving a lot of memory, right? Because we no longer have to, form that matrix or do these dot products and so on. So this is a way of quantifying the amount of memory that we have saved from doing this. And you can do that by just looking at what is a max batch size you can now use in your model as opposed to previously. So here we could use 27% bigger batch size, which is, you know, that's the space saving.
So typically, you said the attention scores were arbitrarily selected, right? Did you try learning that from an existing vanilla self-attention model and then taking an aggregated version of it and implementing it here?
So the question is, did you, instead of doing these like arbitrary distributions, did you instead try to use an existing transformer that has been trained with full self-attention and then kind of, I guess you would aggregate the distributions across an entire data set maybe and see what happens? No, we didn't try exactly that because the distributions at every position vary wildly for every head, can vary wildly, although there are some patterns that we were able to find. So for example, one interesting thing that is not published anywhere but is still kind of cool is that these kinds of language models, so stepping outside machine translation, language models, if you have a deep transformer language model like say GPT-3, and you aggregate the attention distributions across every head at every layer. So for example, for head 16 and layer 12, you apply this to every single example in your validation set, this transformer, and you see what the attention distribution of head 16 and layer 12 is at every position across all of the inputs, and you average them in some way. You will see a kind of pattern in which the heads at the first layers tend to look very globally, meaning like the position that is assigned the max attention. So if you take the argmax of the attention distribution, it usually occurs quite far from the current token's position. So it might occur, you know, like 300 tokens away. But at some point in the middle layers of the model, the attention dramatically narrows. So the maximum attention probability starts to be assigned to tokens that are only like 1 or 2 tokens away from the current position. And then it kind of like branches out again. So then at the top, the final layer tends to have a more global attention pattern as well. So we saw this pattern, my student Simang, who did this project, observed this pattern, and we were wondering why it exists. It happens to just emerge naturally from training a transformer language model. It occurs in a variety of different model sizes and on training data sets. I mean, this is kind of going on a tangent, but we tried to constrain the model during training such that it could no longer learn this pattern. So if this kind of like narrowing and then widening pattern is so crucial to the model performance, then perhaps if the model was forced to learn some other pattern, it would do worse. Unfortunately, we found that it would just learn some other pattern and the performance stayed the same, like the perplexity was unchanged. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of this, but there certainly are differences across different layers. That's about all I can say. There's no real way to explain what is happening. Yes. Sorry, what is the last part? Oh, yeah. So the question is, instead of these arbitrary distributions, and maybe instead of learning them from some pre-trained model or something, can we make them more linguistically motivated? So maybe you can have one head that always looks at the nouns in a sentence, and one head that's looking at, you know, particular syntactic construction or something like that. Yeah, we actually tried this with the cross attention, and in particular, tried focusing on like different parts of speech and so on. Didn't seem to make any difference here, but you know, intuitively it's a nice idea. Then you can certainly interpret the value of having each head by dropping it at test time and see what happens to the model performance. But yeah, it's kind of hard to say anything interesting about what that actually does. Okay, so let's move on then. So this was like the simplest example of a fixed pattern attention. You can't even really call it attention, right? It's just like a fixed pattern that is independent of the input. So now we'll get to some other kinds of more complicated things. I just wanted to start with this local attention. So local attention is essentially just if you're in a left to right language model setup, you're just going to attend over the last k tokens, and you're going to ignore the last anything that is outside of the last k tokens here. So that here the blue is showing what you're actually attending over. You can see that at this position, I'm attending over the last 3 positions and then ignoring everything else. So of course here, I'm not computing the full n by n matrix anymore. I'm only computing the small subset. But the idea is that if I stack up enough of these layers, then as I mentioned before, and as is in your quiz question, the receptive field of this model will actually grow and be capable of handling a quite large sequence at the top layer anyway. I mean, this is not intuitively ideal, I guess, because at every layer, the model only has access to a subset of the positions. But you can imagine at the top layer, if each of these positions has access to the previous like 4,000 tokens from all of the previous layers' computations, then it's still perhaps somewhat informative to do this local attention. And I'll just say now that we're going to talk about a lot of different types of attention, but if you want something that is easy and will work on long sequences, I would just recommend doing this. So make all your attention heads local heads. You can control exactly, the complexity of this method, and I would say it probably works just as well as any of the other more complicated approaches. So it's very unsatisfying, but given enough depth, model size, and data, this is a great approach. It's actually used in almost all of the other efficient self-attention methods. If you closely read these papers, you'll find that like half of the heads in all of these models are local attention heads. And there's no ablation on whether if you remove the local attention heads, do you lose all your performance? You probably do. So it's sad because people want to do exciting research, but something like this is so powerful and necessary. But that's the way it is. So I'm not going to spend any more time explaining this because it's so simple, but it's also very important and it works really well. So the longformer is kind of a variant of this that was highlighted in the survey that you had to read. It has 4 different types of attention. And these are still just fixed patterns. So the local attention, this is a fixed pattern that depends on the position of the sequence. But unlike the hard-coded attention that we talked about previously, here you're actually doing the query key dot product just over a smaller window than the entire sequence. So this is different in that we're not hard coding these attention distributions here. We are actually learning them. It's just the sequence has been truncated. Okay. So here in the longformer, first, they don't use part A, sorry. This is the full n squared attention, right? This is too complicated, too computationally expensive, so we want to use other things. In the longformer, they looked at both a language model, like left to right setup, as well as a BERT style setup where you don't have this constraint that you can't look at things in the future. So this figure is more in that direction. You can see that in the sliding window attention you're looking at, this is essentially local attention but applied to an unmasked setting. So you're looking at words that are both to the left and to the right of the particular position you're at. Again, this is an occurrence of local attention in one of these fancier models, right? This B here is extremely simple, but also effective. So see, the dilated sliding window is very simple. Here, instead of looking at just the contiguous last n tokens and subsequent n tokens, we're going to apply some sort of dilation to the window. So we might skip every other token. And I think in this work, they actually use a function that as you go farther and farther away from the current position, increases the range of this dilation. So maybe close to the current position, I'm only skipping one token at a time. Then as I go farther and farther, I'm skipping 2, 4, 100, 1,000 tokens at a time. But it's still a fixed pattern, right? The pattern does not depend on the content, the actual word at this position. It depends only on the position. And then finally, there's this global attention concept, which is very similar to one of those hard-coded heads that always looks at the first word of the sequence, right? So you can see here that regardless of what position I'm at, I'm always looking at the first 2 tokens in the sequence. And then I'm also looking at some other arbitrary tokens in the sequence. So you can come up with a bunch of different patterns like this. Just, the idea is that the total number of query key dot products you're computing at any time step, that's what you're trying to limit. So you can come up with whatever pattern you want, but it shouldn't be like figure A over here, which is the most expensive. All right. So, there are other approaches that use these fixed patterns. The Linformer takes a different approach. You can see also the creativity in naming going on here. So this one is a little bit more interesting. It doesn't use these fixed patterns or anything like that. Instead, what it does is, so let's say I have my queries and keys, right? I have an n by d matrix that corresponds to every single query projection of at each sequence in the time. So n here is the number of time steps, the number of tokens in my input, let's say. So if I project all of n tokens to the query vector space using my W sub q matrix, I'm going to have n by d matrix that represents all of the query vectors in my input sequence, right? Similarly, I can have an n by d, where d is a dimensionality of the query embedding and the key embedding. I can have an n by d matrix corresponding to the keys as well. So normally in attention, I would just take the dot product, right? Or in this case, the matrix multiplication of both these query and key matrices to get the dot product. But in a Linformer, before you do this, you're going to essentially project both of these matrices down to a much smaller dimensionality, and you're going to do this projection on the sequence length dimension. So you can see it down here. This is our key matrix, or our value matrix, this green one here. It's an n by d matrix, where n is the sequence length. So I'm going to take this matrix, which is a learnable parameter matrix. Let's call it W, W. And it's a k by n matrix. So n, again, is the sequence length. K is a hyperparameter that you choose. It's a fixed value regardless of what position you're at. Let's say k is 5 and n is like 1,000. So you have 1,000 tokens in your sequence, and you set this k to be 5. So when you apply this matrix, when you do this matrix multiplication, your new low rank approximation of this matrix is now size k by d, where k now is 5, right? So I've gone from 1,024, 1,000 n equals 1,000 to k equals 5. I've made this matrix much smaller. So now if I compute my query key dot product using this k by d query and key matrix instead of n by d query by key matrix, this is now much, much faster, right? Of course, this involves knowing before time what your sequence length is going to be, which is very, that's how all of these models are trained. You pick a maximum sequence length. And one of the parameters in your model is dependent on the maximum sequence length. So this is kind of odd. Models usually are not, they don't have parameters that depend on the length of the input, but in this case, it's for a specific reason to do this approximation. So, right, when you do this dot product now, it's much faster, and you can see it in this plot here, where the y-axis is the inference time. So if this is a language model, right, the time it takes to produce a token or some number of tokens. And the x-axis shows the sequence length and also the batch size. So there's different categories of sequence lengths. But this line here is the speed of the vanilla transformer model, which is doing the full n by n self-attention. And then these curves are all different variants of the linformer, where you're varying the k and so on. So they find in their paper that obviously smaller values of k degrade the performance more, and larger values of k, as you get up to the sequence length size, you get better and better performance. But the gaps are not that bad. So if you look at the perplexity here, these are perplexity curves. It's very hard to say that any of these models is better than another, right? All of these curves are kind of overlaid on each other. The standard transformer, this is the validation set's perplexity, by the way, of a language model. The standard transformer's perplexity is very similar to any of these linformers with values of k like 64, 128, and 256. So if you use k equals 256, you're not getting that much savings over a normal transformer, right? You're still doing 256-way self-attention. But k equals 64 is quite a nice speed up here. So yeah, this is a very simple idea. It's cool to see that it works like this, and kind of surprising, honestly. Yeah.
The learned matrix that you talked about, is that for every head? Or
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is this learned k by n matrix for every head? Yeah, for every head you have a separate, because you have separate query and key projections. Wherever you have a separate set of query key projections, you need to have one of these matrices to downsample it. Yeah. The question is, do you have one of these for a query matrix and then another one for a key matrix? I'm not sure if they use the same matrix for both. If you have the same D, the same dimensionality for queries and keys, which you need to do if you're using the scaled dot product approach, which it says they do. So in that case, you can share this matrix across queries and keys. This is a kind of design decision, so I'm not sure what they do in the paper, but both are fine. Yeah. So this is explained in this figure. So this green matrix here is your original value matrix. It's n by d, where n is the sequence length, right? So that is clear. Then you have this matrix, which is k by n. K is a hyperparameter that you choose. It should be smaller than n. So when you do this matrix multiplication, you're going to get a k by d matrix as the result, right? So that's all they're doing. And then this k by d matrix forms their new value matrix, and they're going to similarly have a new query matrix that's also k by d. They can compute the attention using that, and then do the concatenation and feed forward layer and so on. Yeah.
We have a very key vector for every word, but now we're using a key value pair for sequence length n. How does that mapping happen?
So the question is, since we now have a k by d matrix, there's not anymore a mapping between a value vector and a specific token or position in the sequence. Yeah, that's definitely true. And their claim is that that is not useful for the task of language modeling, where, you know, at the end of the day, you're feeding one vector into a softmax layer to predict the next word. This is happening at every position in the sequence, right? So yeah, I mean, again, it's kind of unintuitive that this would work like as well as it does, but it's hard to say what these feed-forward layers are capable of doing, I guess is the takeaway. Yeah. Yeah, I think they used it for other tasks than, I was focused on the language modeling results, which are here. But yeah, I'm not sure actually. Yeah, so the question is, we might be getting nice perplexity, but the downstream performance on another task could be bad. That's definitely, actually let me check, because I can do that. It's nice that they have all of this exposition for such a simple idea. But, you know, you have to fill up the pages somehow. Oh, yeah, I forgot to, actually, I think I might even have this on the next slide. How embarrassing. Yeah. Okay, so I didn't even have to look this up. That's how prepared I am. Yes, so they did try this on, nice question. They did try this on downstream tasks, and the results are similar. Like, these are basically all classification, text classification tasks. SST2 is sentiment, IMDb is sentiment. These are both binary positive, negative sentiment tasks. NLI is an entailment task, so a three-way classification. QQP is a paraphrase data set. So you can see here on this table, compared to a Roberta model, the same architecture is used here, except the attention is replaced with the Linformer attention. So these are all Roberta-based architect, like the transformer is the same size, or as similar as it can be. It's hard to say if there's any notable difference. So no, it doesn't degrade your performance on these specific tasks. It's hard to generalize outside of these claims, though. All right. Yeah. Yeah, so if you look at the architecture here, so well, that's a good question. I would imagine somewhere over here if you have to do next word prediction. Yeah, I'd have to check the paper. Yeah, because the input to each block is an n by, and yeah, maybe it's not depicted in this figure. Okay, so there are all these different methods, and they have been scaled over time, and obviously hardware improvements also enable you to train on bigger sequences. GPT-2 was trained on 1,024 subword tokens as its input, and nowadays we have things like the routing transformer, which are 8,000 plus tokens in input sequence length. You can see that the longformer was able to take about 4,000 tokens. These are subword. These are all using subword tokenization. And language modeling benchmarks, so we'll still continue focusing on language modeling here because that is one of the tasks where long sequences should be useful at least. There have been a bunch of data sets created for language modeling, but many of them are not suitable for assessing the performance of these very long-range models. So if you look at the Penn tree bank, that was the very first, one of the very first data sets that people used for language modeling. The average article length, and this is the word level, is 355 words. So something like any of these approaches is just overkill. It's very easy to train a transformer on this data set. On Wikipedia, if you take a full article as a document, each document is about 3,600 words on average. So still not that big. But this PG-19 data set was recently released, I think last year. And it basically just has a dump of Project Gutenberg. So if you're not familiar with Project Gutenberg, it's essentially a repository of a bunch of books and magazines that are in the public domain, so their copyright has expired and people can just freely access them. And so here, the average length of one of the books, one of the documents in this data set is 69,000 tokens. So this is way bigger than any previous data set. And this data set is basically the one that serves as a benchmark for long-range language models. Obviously, they all also use these character level data sets, but we'll focus on this PG19 data set. So up till now, we've looked at these fixed patterns, these low rank approximations, but the more interesting type of sparse patterns are content-based. So they're kind of learned from the actual tokens in the input as opposed to being fixed beforehand like they are in the longformer. So here we have full attention in a, this is a left to right prediction, right? So this is mask and local attention, which we talked about. And now we're going to spend some time explaining this routing attention, which intuitively is very pleasing, but TBD on its actual performance. The high level of this model is, or this form of attention, is that instead of just using the fixed pattern for every position, this fixed sparse pattern, right? Local attention is ignoring all of these previous values. It's just a variant of sparsity. And so in routing attention, the sparsity is obtained by first clustering all of the words in the sequence. So if I have 8,000 tokens, I can perform something like k-means clustering to cluster all of these tokens into, say, k different clusters. And now I'm going to do self-attention within each cluster. So I get sparsity this way. Now the sparse pattern is defined by the similarity of different tokens to each other. Essentially, this approach is encouraging tokens that are similar to each other across the document to attend to each other. So this is a decision that was made by the creator of this model. It's hard to explain why you might want tokens that are similar semantically to each other to attend to each other. But it's also, one way of using the actual content of the input sequence to adjust the sparsity pattern. And in that way, it's more interesting than all of the previous approaches that we've talked about. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on how this works. But this routing attention is essentially relying on the clustering step to form the pattern of sparsity in this n by n matrix. Yeah, and hopefully this is readable. But essentially, this figure is taken from some work that was done on this model. So if we have an input sequence, we're going to do our multi-head projection to queries and keys. So we have our set of queries for every head and our set of keys. And now we're going to do k-means clustering. So how many of you are familiar with k-means clustering? All right, looks like all of you. Essentially, what you have to do in k-means clustering of vectors is first create like k vectors that are going to form your centroids in the clustering. These are going to be treated as learned parameters in your model. And you're going to adjust these centroids to minimize the within cluster variance of like whatever points are closest to each centroid. So you can apply this clustering process, and then every single query and key in your in the stuff that you computed before will be assigned to a specific cluster. So that's what these colors are representing. At this position, this query was assigned to this orange cluster. Here, there's a blue cluster, a green cluster, and so on. So in this paper, they cluster both queries and keys using the same set of centroid vectors. And the way in which the attention works is that when you are performing self-attention, you're only going to compute the dot products between queries and keys that belong to the same cluster. So that's the idea. I mean, the split between query and key is not shown on this slide, but that is the high level, is that only queries and keys that are assigned to the same cluster are included in the self-attention computation. So you can see the sparsity pattern emerging here, right? Like these orange queries and keys are not looking at any of the blue queries or keys or any of the green queries and keys. And the cluster assignments are a function of the tokens in the input sequence. So this pattern, whatever positions are assigned to orange and blue and green, this pattern will change depending on what the input is, because you have to run the k-means clustering to get these assignments in the first place. So you compute the self-attention. I mean, the gather here is a specific function in libraries like PyTorch that allow you to get these into a contiguous sequence. And once you compute the self-attention, then you will go ahead and scatter these back into the original sequence. So that's just like an implementation detail. But once you do that, so now your queries and keys, the dot products have been computed in this sparse way, and now you're free to compute your attention weighted average of the value vectors using these new scores. So that is generally how this model works. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's not going to be perfect, right? But they take some number of steps to update the centroid within every batch. So the centroids are, I mean, they're not like running this to convergence at every time step or anything like that. Yeah, I mean, it's just like an approximation of a way to get content-based patterns, and there are other approaches that could accomplish the same thing too, probably. Yeah. Yeah, so the distance, so the question is, how do we compute the distances in this kind of clustering? So here you have a vector that is a learned, like it's going to be a centroid in this clustering algorithm, and you have a query vector or a key vector. You can just compute the dot product and use that as the cosine distance. I forget what they actually, oh yeah, they do actually use a cosine distance because they normalize both the queries and keys before computing the dot product. So yeah, essentially they're using the cosine distance. Yeah. Yeah, the question is the number of clusters a hyperparameter. Yeah, it is. I'm not sure what they actually use in the paper, but yeah, it's something you have to choose beforehand. Okay, so this model, they trained it on PG19, like Project Gutenberg data set I was talking about before, and they compare it to a bunch of other models like the local transformer, which I was praising before. The compressive transformer is one of these recurrent memory-based compressive models. You can see that the perplexity improves over the local transformer with a similar architecture. So there is a similar number of layers, same number of heads per layer. The total number of parameters across these two models is kept relatively, I think maybe exactly the same or something like that. So we saw this and initially were excited because this 6-point gain over local transformer is 6 perplexity gain is pretty nice. It clearly indicates that this model is taking advantage of the full 8,000 token context in a way that a local transformer isn't. So a couple of my students decided to analyze how this model is making use of, now that it's theoretically able to, with this clustering mechanism, actually do attention over these huge contexts. What is going on here? Like, how are these clusters helping? What are they learning? Is any of this interpretable? And so on. So Simang, who is basically working on this line of research, and my other student, Kalpesh, were working on this. And probably the most surprising thing we found was basically we took this pre-trained routing transformer model and the pre-trained local transformer model. They're basically directly comparable. And we, at test time, just ran this model on sequences of different lengths. So at test time, we fed it inputs of 1,000 tokens, 2,000 tokens, 3,000 tokens, and we measured the validation perplexity across all of these different chopped off sequences. So the interesting thing that we found, so we expected when the sequences are short that the local transformer and this model would be very competitive with each other because they're short sequences. At some point, local attention is going to be just the same as full attention, and the routing clustering attention is going to be probably pretty similar as well. But you can see that regardless of the prefix length, the same gap of, I don't know how many ever perplexity points it was, 6 perplexity points, exists at all lengths of input. So this is very surprising because it really is indicating that the clustering attention is not taking full advantage of the long-term context. It's more that the clustering attention just makes a better model for even short sequences, which you can see here, like this is sequence length of, I think, 128 or something like that. You can see that a local transformer here is basically just doing full attention, right? And the routing transformer model is getting better perplexity here as well. So this indicates that this routing attention might just be a better form of attention than the normal self-attention, but it's not specifically outperforming anything on long inputs, which is the initial motivation of it. And another interesting thing is that you can see that as you increase the length of the input, the perplexity for this routing transformer model is not dropping. So we would expect, if it's actually taking advantage of tokens that are 8,000 tokens away from the current position, that the perplexity would continue to drop as we gave the model more and more context. That is clearly not happening. In fact, it's actually getting a little bit higher as we add more tokens here. So there's a lot of unknowns with all of this kind of work, and they're not being evaluated properly. So you should be kind of skeptical of any claims that one model is better at modeling long-range dependencies than another model. Yeah.
So the routing of the agents clustering is done for every frequency, right?
Yeah.
So instead of that, if we do something on the vocabulary, like we just increase the K to a lot and do everything.
Oh, that's so I guess the idea that he just said is, instead of having the clusters depend on specific input and the context, what if you just cluster the vocabulary and then use the fixed pattern from that one-time clustering to inform the attention pattern? Is that the idea? Yeah, I mean, that's interesting too. It's kind of similar to what she suggested about having some sort of linguistically informed heads, because you might expect that words of certain classes will cluster together and so on. I don't think anyone has tried that at a scale like this. You also have to be careful to make sure that your heads are actually sparse, the attention is sparse. So one thing that they do in this paper that I didn't mention is that they make each cluster the same size. So they don't do anything special. They allow a token to belong to multiple clusters. That's the simplest way to enforce this constraint. So that way they can control the exact sparsity pattern here. But if you did what you're saying, you probably need to do something similar as well, because otherwise you might have one cluster with all of the vocabulary in it and so on. Yeah.
Did you test out, or do you test out on the image table? This might just have to do with the fact that the data set doesn't need one.
Yeah, so the question is, have you tested out these models on something like images where it's very clear that long-range dependencies exist depending on how you format your sequence compared to some task like language modeling? No, but I think your broader point is a good one, that this task of predicting the next word, it's very unclear how it requires long-range dependencies, right? So if you imagine you're reading a book and you're doing this task of language modeling where you read, like 8,000 tokens and then you're asked to predict what word comes next. Intuitively, if you're reading a book, like it should be helpful to have all of the context present, right? You'll probably know the full sequence of events if you're reading some fictional book, right? And know all the characters and how they should react and so on. And all of this should be helpful in predicting the next word intuitively for a human, right? But then if you go to this task of language modeling and you ask the question, find me a context in which I need the word at position 8048 to make this prediction of the next word. And if I don't have this word, then I won't be able to make this prediction. It's almost impossible to find cases like this. We actually found some where you have a book with chapters. So it's like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And in between each occurrence of the chapter heading, there's like thousands of tokens of text, like the actual text of the chapter. And then you get to, like chapter 6, and you feed the model chapter in the last 8,000 tokens and ask it to predict what comes next. Here is a case where it really has this dependence on the words in the past, because it has to know that the last chapter that was observed was chapter 5 in order to predict chapter 6. If that came thousands of tokens away, then it needs to be modeling this. And this model is actually good at doing these very simple formulaic types of increment by one predictions, but that's an isolated case, right? In general, it's hard for the task of next word prediction specifically to imagine a case where you need long-term context, and if you don't have that, you won't be able to make the prediction. It's easier to imagine in a case where you're predicting, like multiple words, or you ask the model to generate the next scene of a story, right? Here, you clearly need to know a lot of stuff from the long-range context. But when you localize the prediction to just the next word, it depends a lot more on just like syntactic constraints. You can get away with shortening your window to, like 20 words and probably do a good job of predicting the next word. So yeah, I think you're correct. The biggest problem here is the training objective, regardless of the sparsity of the attention pattern, the training objective does not incentivize the model to use information in the long-term context. So I could say more about all of this, but I think that's, this was a pretty interesting experiment, so maybe I'll talk about this. So here we were examining the model's ability to copy a sequence in its input context. So if I had the sentence like the cat was sleeping, and I had 8,000 other words after that occurrence, and then I gave the model the cat and see, what is the probability of is sleeping here. Of course, we used some other sequences, so there weren't any like content issues. But you can see that the model's ability to copy a sequence that it's seen is very good. So this is the perplexity of the copied sequence when the last occurrence of that sequence is close by in the context. But when it gets to about 1,000 tokens away, the model is now no longer to essentially copy it at all from the context. This is kind of a proxy task to how well is the model using the long-term context. Because if it's using the long-term context, it should be able to still know that, this is an exact copy of something I've seen before. I should assign very high probability to the thing that I observed. But that's not happening after a few thousand words. So yeah, the takeaway of this lecture is that there's a bunch of methods to compute efficient attention that are not n-squared. They use a lot of sparsity. There are different patterns that you can apply to make these things more efficient. You can use content-based attention like the routing transformer. But within the context of language modeling and NLP, it's not clear whether, while they're theoretically able to model really long sequences, if in practice they're actually doing anything at all with the information that's present in the past. So yeah, that's it. See you on Monday.